psychologist friend of mine who's saying that the Christians are worshipping a sadomasochistic instrument of torture with a flagellated naked guy pinned on it. This is a collective perversion. Joan of Arc. In her childhood, she communicated with fairies. In early adolescence, she heard the voice of God. She had a schizotypal personality disorder characterized by behavioral eccentricities and anomalies of cognition. When she was brought to trial, the charges that were held against her included the clever question as to why God would favor the French to the English. This was not enough to convict her. The divine origin of her voices were questioned by bringing up her early communication with fairies. What finally did convict her was the fact that she wore men's clothes during battle. In her cell, she was tricked. They took away her women's clothes and left her only men's clothes. In order to cover herself up, she had to wear these men's clothes and was convicted and executed. The king, whom she brought to the throne, canonized her in order to keep his credibility and his crown. This is Teresa of Avila, another interesting saint who had a direct line to the divine. And she disregarded the chain of the command, which raised some eyebrows within the Inquisition. They investigated her, and she was urged to stop levitating in front of the nuns. She started writing books to prove that her voices were not diabolical in origin. Today, we would diagnose her with a neurological dysfunction. Saint Francis squandered away his father's money on wild parties with dubious friends, until one day, exhausted by disease, he found refuge in a chapel. And there he heard the voice of God. Hearing the voice of God was socially accepted during this time period. And now, these saints would be diagnosed with several neurological dysfunctions. We can also see in the representation of the halo that some lucid painters have detected the problem in the brain area. So that would give another light. Anybody recognizes this cute rock star couple? Anyone? Yeah. Who is this? Who is it?
Bada.
Yeah, Bada and Enslin. So, pimp and prostitute dynamics. Yes, this is interesting. There was a movie that recently came out called the Bada Mining Complex, and I think some facts were a little wrong. What we want to look here, the typical dynamic between the prostitute and the pimp is a dynamic of domination and dependency, which was the case here too. When we think about, are you familiar with the 68 movement in Germany and this whole history? So it had a whole different function. 68 movement in Germany because after the Nazi regime, the high-ups in the government were put away in an Entnazifizierung and came back to their exact same positions as judges and university professors and so on, etc. So the 68 movement was not d'accord with this. And they unveiled this through investigative journalism. Now, they were not really part of that, but they were a splinter group from this. And what's interesting is that Ensling's father, who was a cleric, congratulated her on doing something against social injustice, which his generation had failed to do. This means that they were living in an emotional reality that was no longer valid. This was in 1968, and they were emotionally in a different time period. Interestingly enough, so let's see here, in the movie he was portrayed as a wacky, aggressive male, but he was a psychopath. Okay? And yeah, this is a Meinhof, and the interesting part also here is that Ulrike Meinhof's daughter, whom she dragged along into the underground with her other daughter, later in the 90s, when her mother was now dead, had accused the then foreign minister Joschka Fischer of being part of the German terrorist group. So she too lived in a different time frame, a different emotional reality. And what's interesting to see here is that the whole left was criminalized because of these people who collectively committed suicide in the high-security prison of Stammheim. We could call them hardcore romantics with a death wish. I have nothing furthermore to add. Jackson Pollock became very famous. We all know why he became famous. He was a genius and a drunk. He was a genius drunk. And, he had some help with Lee Krasner to become famous, but why did he become this extremely successful? And the reason why he became extremely successful was that the CIA made him that big. So when he realized that he was a pawn in the Cold War to show the Russians how free the American artists were, he killed himself. This is Walter Benjamin. Sad story, I can't really talk about it. And here, a picture, we could think about like this long chain of accidents that the Kennedys have experienced. I would bet if we would research in the family tree, we would find this had been going on for generations. Why a president on the top of his career gets the second hottest girl in history, and then he gets himself killed. And his brother next in line, same thing, gets himself killed, etc. There must be some psychological reason for that. I can't really talk about Jimi Hendrix, that would seem blasphemic to me. So, the statement that John Lennon said, "We're bigger than Jesus," was brilliant. Because rock stars or rock and roll at that time had a huge influence on a predominantly young audience. And the music industry was not controlled as it is now. So rock stars had like this enormous impact that could not be controlled. And this is not the case today. We have Wilhelm Reich, a thinker and psychologist who wrote books like Mass Psychology of Fascism and The Function of Orgasm. He was a Marxist thinker and was ill-regarded during the McCarthy era. They could not get at him because of his books. But what they could do, and also first before I switch to the next picture, the next image, I want to know who of you are familiar with the acronym ODD? Anybody? Well, it's a new identified syndrome. It's called oppositional defiancy disease. Okay, it's not ADHD, so it's people who are opposing. Sorry, etc.
Yeah.
So what they got him with was that he built this orgone accumulator. So his life's work dealt with the human body, its energy, and the body and the human in society. He invented the orgone accumulator where universal energy would be collected. You could sit in it and receive it. Okay. So he built them and sold them via mail order. So this apparently violated some state laws and some tax laws. So he was arrested. Now, both his parents killed themselves. So, and I think that had a huge impact on him because during his trial he refused to have a lawyer. So he had like this self-saboteur in him. He refused to get a lawyer and he told the judge to read his books. The judge didn't like that. And he was brought to jail, sentenced to 2 years, and died after 1 year by a heart attack. And his books were publicly burned. Yes, so this was the presentation, Icons on the Couch.